Let me first thank you and all of the participants of today's webinar for joining the series of Jai Jagat webinars, which will be taking place throughout the next month. As people who have been following the process, I will just give a little bit of a context of where we stand. The walk, the march, the global march for nonviolence and peace, Jai Jagat, was unfortunately stopped here in Armenia, which began on October 2nd, 2019, on Mahatma Gandhi's 150th anniversary. And the idea was to walk through 10 countries over 14,000 kilometers to make it all the way to Geneva, September of 2020. So unfortunately, this coronavirus has made us switch, and as of March 17th, after our great colleagues walked in India, parts of Iran, and of course half of Armenia, most of them had to fly back to their home countries. But because we didn't want to stop the whole thing, we're going to use the internet, and we are going to continue working together through the online means. So my name is Arsen Kharatyan. I am the coordinator of Jai Jagat in Armenia. Together with Liz and some other colleagues, we have been discussing grassroots movements. We've been talking about nonviolence and nonviolence and peace building and conflict resolution for a number of years. But today's topic, as we all know, is going to be from the Armenian Velvet Revolution to Jai Jagat, a very general topic, but about we're going to try to link a little bit what happened in Armenia 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago. Our goal was to do this on March 31st, when the International Conference for Peace and Nonviolence was supposed to happen in the middle of the walk, but as it was terminated, as I said, we're continuing online. With this, Liz, I would suggest that you maybe introduce yourself in a couple of words. Also, your short bio and everything is there, just to give a background, and then maybe we can go ahead and start our presentations for the listeners.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Arsen. My name is Liz Theoharis, and I am the director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary, which is in New York City, New York. I'm also the co-chair of a nonviolent direct action movement in the United States called the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And I'm looking forward to more conversation about justice and peace building and Jai Jagat.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Liz. Thank you for joining us and finding time. I hope New York is treating you well, as crazy as it looks, and it's as crazy as it seems these days. We here in Armenia, of course, are facing similar challenges as elsewhere in the world, but I'll give maybe a couple of opening remarks about what happened in Armenia, what has been going on since then, and where we are. I hope that we won't be too boring for the people who are now probably overly packed with discussions on coronavirus, and it seems like there may have been a lot of media fatigue from COVID-19 discussions. However, let's keep it positive. The figures, the numbers, the media aspect of all of this is quite concerning, and so we'll try to, as I said, go with a positive note. So 2 years ago, many of you may have followed, Armenia went through one of the greatest political social changes in its history since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when a nonviolent movement, which began in the second largest town on March 31st, just about 2 years ago, brought a couple of dozen people, political activists, politicians, few of them, and the civic activists and civil society representatives who said enough is enough, we're fed up, we're not going to take this. But we know and understand that we cannot do anything with weapons and arms. We've tried many ways. Many have tried to bring about change for a number of years, over 2 decades, through different means, but it did not work out. So we're going to go with nonviolence. We're going to go with the means that were used by Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, all of the great leaders of nonviolence and nonviolent and of course civic disobedience. This brought the walk took place for 2 weeks. Just before a strongman was who changed the constitution of the country and who was trying to be elected or continue his kleptocratic power for another, who knows how long. And so the few people who started this together with students, some of whom are joining us here on this webinar, believed in this. I would say at the very beginning of the march, there were very few people who would take this seriously. And as we arrived in Yerevan, which is the capital of Armenia, on April 13th, 14th, hopefully the quarantine will be gone by that time this year. But not a large crowd was welcoming us. There would be maybe a couple of thousand people. This, sure enough, within a week grew into a huge, massive movement that independent Armenia has not seen. And that basically continued with a snowball effect, with a lot more people from all over the world, including the Armenian diaspora, joining online and or joining by different means, supporting this process, and little by little seeing that this kind of change is actually possible. I would say the uniqueness of the Armenian Revolution was in the fact that in one of the most militarized countries in the world, a country that is landlocked, a country that has been deprived of economic activities and integration of the smaller region. But it became possible also because some of the very unique means were used, such as decentralization, putting responsibility on people and different groups themselves, being creative, basically announcing that people can and should be taking responsibility in their own hands, and basically not calculating geopolitics and or continuously trying to understand, oh, is this possible or not? This was possible also because the leadership of the revolution, the people who believed and wanted to go, were ready to sacrifice all they could, and you could see that, you could tell. Anyway, so I won't go into the details of the history. What happened was hundreds of thousands, in a country of 3 million, hundreds of thousands of people going out in the streets. There was a day I remember that every single possible little avenue or street was closed and or blocked by people. There were so many beautiful pictures of how people are taking their own responsibility of doing things. People protesting with small kids, people protesting with cars, horses in town. I don't know, anything you can imagine. But sure enough, this created a situation where the regime that was in charge had to basically pull back, and a new government was set for a short period of time. There was the crisis because the parliament that was not reflecting the vote of the people was still in charge, and by the end of 2018 there was a snap parliamentary election which basically created a new government with a new parliament. Currently here in Armenia we're going through some major challenges, not just because of the coronavirus, but of course because of the change that we're aspiring to through for the legal system. Now, 2 years of post-revolution, a lot of ideas, a lot of good intentions and some good undertakings. But the major issue that we are facing, the challenges that we're facing, is generally the fight against corruption, an eroded state apparatus, an eroded system that has been built based on a kleptocracy, basically, on corruption. But I will have to say that no less difficult is it to deal with the mental violence, the media, the enormous amount of the disinformation and misinformation, the hate speech that has gone viral. And I think one of the key challenges here is that we are trying to find ways. Yes, the revolution happened through nonviolent means. It was a unique nonviolent velvet revolution. But how do you do nonviolent governance? How do you contain, not only contain, but sustain and develop through nonviolent means? So these are maybe open questions that I would also like to hear your input on, Liz, but also generally saying, I think we are at a very interesting juncture where there is a generational change in Armenia, a generation of politicians and people who are in politics. This is the last chapter of the Soviet history of Armenia, with whatever is coming next. And I wish all the success to us and to the rest of the world in helping us come together. I'll stop right here, and I'll maybe get the floor going with you, and maybe some of the other friends who are joining us online will have questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was really so helpful. And surely is a, we do wish you, I do wish you, and the poor of the United States wish Armenia all the power, all of the democracy, all of the fight for this next time. So I'm really glad to join everybody today, and to you, Arsen, because and to be helping to kick off this series that Jai Jagat is putting together, coming out of Armenia. For me, that is really important and special. My grandparents fled Armenia during the genocide, and the first and only time I've ever been able to come to Armenia was by connecting with Jai Jagat and with yourself and other freedom fighters there. And so it's wonderful to be with you. When you were talking about, this Velvet Revolution happening 2 years ago, I was thinking about what was happening in the United States 2 years ago. Today, April 4th, is the 52nd anniversary or commemoration of the death of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968, because there were striking sanitation workers, garbage workers, who were on strike in Memphis, across Tennessee, because of the racism and poverty that were impacting so many low-wage workers back then. And he was in the midst of building what would be his last campaign, a campaign that he was not able to successfully finish, which was called the Poor People's Campaign. And what Dr. King proposed in this last campaign and in the last years of his life, and what he was advocating for and fighting for nonviolently when he was killed, was for poor people in the United States, across race, across geography, across issue, to come together to build a multiracial, intergenerational, nonviolent army of the poor. So he proposed that thousands of poor people from different communities should come to Washington, D.C. and stay there, basically, in nonviolent protest until people's needs were met. And this was as the Vietnam War was raging on. This was as the world was becoming more militarized, and he saw the connections between racism in the United States, poverty worldwide, and the problem of violence and militarism. and said that the weak point, the Achilles heel of those three evils was to unite poor people in the United States with poor people across the world into a powerful nonviolent movement. So he was killed 52 years ago. And so 2 years ago, myself and other leaders in the United States with a new poor people's campaign, ours is taking up the baton from where Dr. King and others left off. We were actually standing on the balcony of the hotel where he was shot down, vowing publicly to pick up that fight, that nonviolent fight, and bring it the next mile of the way, the next kilometer of the way. And so from there, we launched 40 days of nonviolent, very active direct action, nonviolent civil disobedience, where people in 43 states across the United States and in Washington, D.C. engaged in 40 days of non-cooperation and nonviolent direct action, targeting our elected officials, our Congress, our president for passing unjust, violent policies that impact poor people, impact low-wage workers, impact people without health care, impact families that can't afford water all across the United States. In the year 2020, in the United States of America, before even the coronavirus hit, there were 140 million people who were poor and low income. Almost half of the US population is experiencing some form of poverty. 40% can't afford a $400 emergency, 60% can't afford a $1,000 emergency. Well, the coronavirus has been that emergency. And so we have 2/3 of our population now actually experiencing a lack of food, a lack of healthcare, a lack of adequate wages, and who are really struggling just to survive, let alone actually kind of thrive. So what this calls for, both before the coronavirus hit and as many of these inequalities, inequities are laid bare because of this crisis, what it means is that poor people and all people of conscience across the country are trying to come together and build a nonviolent movement. And that means that we must engage in nonviolent direct action. It means that we must call out the violence of our society. And so one of the things that has been really motivating and moving to us and to me is the work and the model that Dr. King basically modeled in his life, and what he called people to do in engaging over decades in direct action, in organizing people, in calling out the wrongs and evils of society, and asking people and compelling people to organize together in nonviolent ways through marches, through protests, through sit-down campaigns, through writing. Dr. King, the night before he was killed, said, we can't stop now. And what we see is the kind of interconnection of all of us, and that we either go up together or we all go down together. When he was shot down, his wife, Coretta Scott King, was talked to right after, and folks said, well, what do you say about this question of violence? What do you say about this idea that your husband, who advocated nonviolence, was shot down so violently? And she said, well, yes, what happened to my husband and our family was surely violence. But then she says, but I must remind you that starving a child is violence. Neglecting school children is violence. Punishing a mother and her family is violence. Discrimination against a working man is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. Ignoring medical need is violence. Contempt for the poor is violence. And an apathetic attitude towards any of these problems is violence. And so to me, she really models for us what it looks like for us to engage in direct action, organizing, and nonviolent non-cooperation with systems of oppression and marginalization, and the defining of all of these inequalities, all of these inequities as actually violent, and needing to confront them with nonviolence. And so that's exactly what we're trying to do, and trying to link up with groups all over the world that are doing a similar, following a similar model. And so that's why it's so good to be with you all today.
Wonderful, Liz. Thank you for this great background of MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., and then, of course, some of the aspects of the history of nonviolence in the United States, as well as, of course, the wealthiest country having so many different issues and diverse issues. However, while we're here, and of course, currently the world is probably transforming in the sense of teleworking or doing stuff from home is becoming more and more important, and or the only way oftentimes. However, it's interesting how I mean, people who are involved in conflict resolution, people who are involved in peace building and other aspects of the movement through nonviolence know what structural violence is, something that has been formalized and or made more of a theory out of. But what we're actually seeing now here in Armenia specifically is a lot of the examples of mental violence, verbal violence. We are, I mean, it seems to me that we are going through a time, and I mean, the smaller society in general, but we're going through a time when everything is basically allowed and there is no censorship whatsoever. The internet, as many good things as it brought, it also brought a much wider options and possibilities for a lot of the verbal violence. And I don't know really if anybody can say there is one answer to how you deal with that. We are seeing times of endless hate speech. We are seeing which in my personal view is inevitably going to end up with more violence, also physical violence. And I don't know if there is any way that you can restrict this from happening. Media literacy, other ways of doing things maybe, but there are so many options and ways of doing it nowadays without direct contact that I think that the challenge is common for everyone. And I think I don't have one answer to how you have to or we can deal with it. Each one of us, and generally how people do it in the world. Like, for example, in the US, we're seeing a very different time also. I don't even know if this coronavirus is creating moratorium in a way on this enormous amount of hate speech out there. I hope this, I mean, as bad as it is, this could have become a point for unity and trying to solve issues together. In some cases it's successful, in others it's not as successful, but generally saying, what would you say about this? How do you deal with verbal mental violence?
I mean, I think we in the United States are for sure seeing an uptick in that as well, right? Whether it's towards different people from different countries of the world, right? There's a real increase in xenophobia and in racist hate speech happening online, happening in live streams. There's been some instances even in some communities where there are white racist supremacists who are organizing, who are trying to go and use this virus in ways to spread it to particular communities. What we're seeing actually is that poor and marginalized communities and communities of people of different races in the United States are being the hardest hit. And what we're seeing is that the governmental response and the response from the wealthy and corporations has been to bail themselves out, but to leave many of the people still in an economic violence. What that looks like is that there still is no universal healthcare plan. So there are still tens of millions of people in the United States in this crisis who have no access to healthcare. There's been no extension of paying workers when they're sick, that they can still get some pay. So many low-wage workers are being forced to still work and spread this virus more because the largest corporations in the world have made it so that they do not get paid, and in fact are lowering low-wage workers' wages as we speak. And then what's happened also is that even though they could find all of these resources to kind of bail out the richest corporations, what's happening is that many states are having to then fund how they respond to this crisis from their existing budgets. And so one of the places, like, we've done a lot of work in a state like Kentucky, which is in the mountains, kind of the center of the country, kind of southern. It's where the Senate Majority Leader of the United States, Mitch McConnell, that folks maybe hear about, is from. It's a state that has a long history of racist violence. It's a state that has a long history of powerful nonviolent struggle. But currently, to be able to respond to the coronavirus, they've had to take money out of violence prevention programs in the state. And so they're literally taking money out of domestic violence and battered, abused women and children programs, and in fact, arming the police and the military with more resources. And so it's actually increasing violence, both in people's homes. There's been a real increase in people experiencing violence and conflict in their homes, as they're now having to be compelled to stay at home. And then also, what's happening is that the police force is being even more supported and militarized in this time. And so there's been some powerful coming together where people want to, in this moment of crisis, see our commonalities. There's been a lot of folks' eyes who've been open to some of the inequities of the country and of the world. But there's also this real threat of increased violence, both mental, emotional, and physical in this moment.
This is very interesting. I had no idea. I mean, we're trying to read the news and understand, and of course, the socially vulnerable groups, especially when it comes to the poverty scale, and of course, different groups being more of or becoming more of a target of all of this is of course incredible, and it's very interesting. And I'm sure a lot of the corporate interests, a lot of the companies, especially in a far right government-led countries, so not only the U.S. but other places, are going to take advantage of the situation, and of course trying to of course get a use of their own employees and people. It's interesting though to hear you say that police and the enforcement is becoming more of a priority. There was also quite a controversial discussion in our parliament here in Armenia earlier this week on the renewed surveillance mechanisms. And this has been an issue not only here, but also other countries. Georgia is trying to do the same thing. Russia is doing it. This comes as an example from Southeast Asia. I think South Korea and some other countries did this first, and people viewed this as an immediate threat to their privacy and the information. Of course, it was also about the packaging and how it was presented, and the government here in Armenia, I believe personally, that was coming from the best of their intentions. But Harari wrote a very interesting article about how this will allow or give more tools to the state players mostly, or the corporations, to use this time to be able to have more surveillance and or collect more data. And we all know that data is being collected. We all know that. I mean, you're in Google, you're on Facebook, we're everywhere. I mean, this has been long proven. But in many countries where you have where you have the legal system working better, citizens generally trust their government, or maybe they don't. I don't know. But it is interesting. How do you think? And I'm kind of changing the topic, and then after this, maybe we can go ahead and see if our colleagues who have joined us who have questions. I see one question at least in the Q&A section. But to maybe touch upon, how do you see or think this time of crisis, as they say in hardcore or realpolitik, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? So how do you think this crisis can or will affect a collection of personal data or cybersecurity on citizens level?
Yeah, I really appreciate this, and I'm surely not a great expert on these matters, but what you're talking about is happening there, and that you're aware of in Georgia and Russia, is surely happening in the United States as well. You know, there every day there's another kind of news report of, you know, Zoom communications or freeconferencecall.com or just, you know, the different browsers and that exist, that it is all about collecting data. It's all not for the public good, right? On the one hand, so these corporations are collecting data about, you know, people's use, but then also the content to which people are, you know, using these technologies to discuss. But at the same time, in the United States, no data is really being collected about who's being impacted by COVID-19 and some of the inequities in our healthcare system and in our economy, right? So on the one hand, you have corporations able to track and follow and collect information and be able to then, you know, in some level, actually weaponize that information against, either by marketing campaigns or by actually being able to target particular groups. And we're seeing some examples of that. And on the other hand, in the midst of this crisis, there is no, you know, widespread understanding or even desire to know and track who's being impacted, where people are staying, and how people are making it through. You know, so we have the resources to track down people's information and use it against them, but somehow we don't find the resources to house the homeless, to feed the hungry, to ensure the uninsured. And in some cases, you know, we're a part of a national organizing drive of homeless people across the country. There's anywhere between 8 and 12 million people who are homeless in the United States right now as we speak. And those homeless people, those families, the average age actually of a homeless person is a child. So it's not just the kind of stereotypical notion that it's just single adults, but families that are experiencing homelessness right now, you know, have no place to social distance or shelter in place or be safe from some of the you know, the spread of this virus. To themselves or from themselves to others. But instead, what we've been hearing reports of is that the police are, you know, tracking people's whereabouts. Again, not to actually help people, not to find housing for people, because at the same time as we have almost 12 million homeless, we have more abandoned housing units than homeless people. So it's not that there isn't enough, it's just how it's distributed that's wrong. But we've been hearing accounts of police, accounts of different telephone companies being able to kind of track the movements of homeless people, but to be able to police them rather than meet people's needs. And so I think, you know, we can expect more of that. And one of the things that folks are still looking into is some of the stimulus bill. Again, the United States passed the largest stimulus package in history. And it's really basically the largest passing through of money from the people, from the bottom to the top, because who gets to control and where that money is going is primarily to the corporations, including communications firms, including military firms, including police forces. And so, I think we unfortunately have to expect more tracking, more policing, and more violence as a result of this, and surely not less.
Yeah, one could have said it's a chicken and egg issue. I don't know, and you're dealing with such a big system. But I'm gonna suggest getting maybe to our attendees with two questions for now. Helga Merkelbeck, I'm sorry if I did not announce or did not read your last name correctly. Says, can you tell us something about the water distribution since the Velvet Revolution? Is it privatized or not? I'll touch upon that very quickly. And then we have a second question from an anonymous attendee. What role can narratives play in moving towards a more non-violent governance? So so what about the water system in Armenia, or if you meant the Armenian water system? It's most of the water systems, when we're talking about the irrigation systems, these are state-run. They are owned by the state. The drinking water system, especially in the capital of Yerevan, is through a contract to a French company. It used to be an Italian company, but it's a leasing contract. The water issue in Armenia, of course, as in most countries, most countries in this region, can be, but we're lucky, is there, but we're lucky with the scale of the mountains. We are a mountainous region. We do have a lot of water. The management of water is something that needs to be addressed, that's for sure. So nothing has changed since the revolution in the water system. This is to answer the first question, and I'll quickly maybe touch upon the question of the narratives and moving towards a more violent governance system. I think if we're talking about the classical understanding of the monopoly of the state over violence, in that police and the military and the security systems, I think there needs to be a much wider and much bigger discussion about this, because the challenges we're facing today are often are so different from what it used to, that police and other security organizations are not enough to cover. And again, I will get back to education. I think education is one of the key parts of how we should move forward from, again, with the challenges. Maybe I am touching the media too much, but I think this is becoming an exponentially big problem. So media literacy is the name of the game. I think in many places, in some countries, they've made it mandatory for schools, but I think it has to become a systemic thing, institutionalizing non-governance through education and bringing it to the discussion from the very early stage, when the kids start school, to the universities, to the way we talk to each other, to the way we handle things. I think my answer to the question is mostly dealing with education. Liz?
Thanks so much for that. So I'm really interested in this question around water and the privatizing of water, because I don't know how aware folks are, but the privatization of water systems is a huge issue in the United States currently. There are 15 million families who, before this coronavirus crisis happened, that could not afford their water. 15 million families. And there's 4 million families who have poisoned water, unclean water, undrinkable water, because of basically corporate dumping and other kinds of poisons and toxins getting into the water. So it's it's a pretty big crisis. The question of the lack of affordability is because of a privatized system, or the move towards privatization in the country. And so you have a company like Nestle, who has a contract with the Detroit, Michigan Water and Sewage Department to be able to bottle and sell as much of the water that they can from the Lake Michigan, one of the bodies of fresh water in the United States that is some of the most accessible ones in the world. So Nestle can bottle and sell as much of Lake Michigan as it wants for paying a lease of $250 US dollars a year. So they're a multinational corporation that makes billions off of the water that they sell, and they pay $250 a year. That same water, you can have residents who are living in deep poverty get $1,000 a month water bills, have their water shut off, so that then there's 100,000 families without water right now. Now, we've been able to win through this coronavirus that some moratoriums on water shutoffs, and some folks' water is getting shut back on. But still, this question of water privatization is a really important one. And so there's a lot to learn from the struggle in Armenia. When it comes to this question of nonviolent governance and narrative shift, I really appreciate the answer around education and around media education. One of the things that I'm most worried about right now, actually in this moment of crisis, at least in the United States, is the way that it's rapidly moving forward, an attack on our democratic systems, and especially in 2020, because there's a very significant presidential election about to take place. What we've seen over the last 10 years has been widespread voter suppression in the United States. There are 23 states who since 2010 have passed voter suppression laws. And you can then tie those states directly to the states that have the highest poverty, that have the least protections for immigrants, that have the least environmental protections, have the, like a lot of bad things and injustices that are happening can be tied to basically politicians getting smuggled into office because of voter suppression, because of an attack on our democracy, and then passing policies that hurt people. And what we're seeing now in this coronavirus is that our political system is allowing even more massive voter suppression and an attack on our democracy. And so a lot of states have had to, or have chosen to, postpone presidential primaries because of this virus. But postponing them means more or less kind of canceling them. And then some of the billions of dollars that it's going to take to basically ensure that people could vote in a primary or in the general election and transfer, actually overhaul our democracy and our voting system, that has not been passed in the stimulus, even though $500 billion for corporations to do whatever they want was passed. And so what I think is happening right now is a real attack on democracy, using this crisis to kind of block a democratic process from developing. And I think we should be very concerned about it. And so part of that is about talking about voter suppression and an impoverished democracy. And some of that is also then there are particular bills and policies we can push to make sure that the democracy isn't done away with in this crisis.
Well, thank you. I had no idea about the scale of the issue on the water. I think I can go ahead and ask you on anything that comes to the utilities and other things nowadays in America, because this was really a lot of interesting figures. And then, of course, with the scale of economy that we're talking about, I can imagine what the corporate interests are there. But I think we've touched upon it. I don't see many other questions. I think I don't want to bore everyone for too long, but I would say let's have another 5 or 10 minutes of a talk about maybe limiting democratic rights or taking advantage of the situation when it comes to. Oh, I see another question. We're talking about David Petrosyan, our friend, is asking about the reforms in Armenia. I'll touch upon that, David. Thank you for the question. But I think I would like to maybe suggest that a couple of remarks or points on how you've talked about it a little bit already, Liz, but how and where we see limitation of citizens' rights, not only by the private sector taking advantage of the situation, but also governments and maybe, yeah, I mean, corporate interests also, corporations also. I think this is a time where we are, where regular citizens are basically isolated. And what are the possible ramifications of this self-isolation situation? I mean, what can be, I mean, in some cases, as I was presenting the Armenian case, the parliament and the government were trying to openly discuss the change, and that created a huge spark. I think, in my personal view, this government here, a lot of my friends also there with the best intentions, have a huge issue with communication. And communication is key in general. It's a challenge for everyone. I'm talking about strategic communication, not only within the government itself, but also with people in general, but with the citizens. But I think the cyber part of it, the collecting of people's personal information and other things are going to be and still are major issues that I don't know how, where, and what is going to happen. But also the economic crisis that we're going to face. I'm sure soon enough we will have investigative journalists and others talk about how different, starting from pharmaceutical companies, medical companies, the hospitals, the huge other institutions that are involved at this time of crisis, who, what, and how are going to benefit from this, as bad as it sounds, and where should we be looking for or areas to be careful on not limiting citizens' rights.
I would love to hear a little bit more on that topic from your experience in Armenia. I surely have some more thoughts on it too, but I would love to hear, you know, if you have suggestions or experiences that you think are applicable in this moment.
Well, I think this Milun Kutari also asked a question about the dilemma if the governments have to track those that may be affected by the virus and use personal data like mobile phone information. How can this be avoided? I think that's dear Milun, that's what we were trying to talk about. I think it's pretty much inevitable, I think. And at this time we have to be, I really don't know if this is possible to avoid. Sometimes I am seeing that in some cases, in the countries where you have a functioning police state and or a different type of discipline, things are more containable. In the countries like Western Europe, where you have more democracy and our system functions in a different way, it's less so, although of course it's different from Italy to Spain to Germany to UK. Now, I don't think, I think the only way is to have the watchdogs follow and not allow any government or any state organization to be able to enter your personal territory and space. But I think some of the things are going to be unavoidable, and we will be seeing the ramifications later. As for David Petrosyan's questions on the reform, I think the key, one of the biggest changes since the revolution, I would say, is the fact that the systemic corruption is eliminated, in that the government itself, the top level political elite, has not been spotted with corruption cases. Some of the controversial cases are there, but they need to be addressed, and we will see. But I think that very fact is big. Some other areas have been addressed so far. We're talking about some reforms in the tax system, and this is related to the economic interests. I think, as David and others here in Armenia know, the military has been addressed. Some specific things have been dealt with there. The military Armenia being in the war, basically. The Defense Department is the largest and had the largest share of the state budget, and of course has to deal with most of the people. I think in some areas, some of the social reforms are there as well. Probably not enough in my personal view, but you have at least more trust, generally saying, for the intention of the government, and that has been proven so far. I will not say I would expect more quicker reforms, but we're dealing with major changes and transformations since the previous governments, and one of the previous presidents is in jail. And so this creates, of course, a lot more tension in the country and in the society in general. I don't know if I was able to answer the questions, but this is what I have.
That's awesome.
So if we are good, I think as a first try, this probably was quite a successful meeting. At least for me, it was a great pleasure to see you.
Yeah, the same.
And I hope we keep doing this, and let's join our future speakers in the upcoming days if we can find time, and we'll try to make sure that we find the right time so colleagues from the US and other time zones can join us too. I want to thank our participants and attendees for joining us today for the talk. I'm not sure if we've fulfilled all the interest on specifically Jai Jagat, but at least we shared some of our thoughts at this time of crisis. And I want to assure all of us, wish everyone good health, and suggest that we all stay home, I guess, for a little longer. Bear with it, not get extremely bored, but try to find some good use of this time, please.
That's great. Yeah, thanks so much for having us here, and yeah, to the participants for joining us. And I look forward to a lot more conversation. This is clearly a time when we need global cooperation and nonviolence and non-cooperation with unjust systems. And so how great to be able to share this with those that are a part of Jai Jagat and other kind of global movements around the world. So thank you so much, Arsen, and it's so good to see you.
Excellent. Thank you. Jai Jagat.
Jai Jagat.